Peter here once again. And then just in terms of the format, Peter will do a short presentation because we felt that it is really important to understand a little bit the simulation tool here in, so to speak, in the foundation, its foundation, which has been developed by Professor David together with his colleague, Professor Roy Leahy. And after that, we will open up for your questions and have also Il-Cheong Yi from UNRIST coming along for his comments. And at that point also, I do want to acknowledge UNRIST as a co-sponsor of this event, which we're actually quite pleased to have on board because it's the first time, I think, that we actually jointly organize an event here. So thanks a lot for this, and Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to stand here so I can see what's going on the, that's great. So, yeah, great. Thank you very much at short notice to sort of putting on this presentation. Just a couple of things to note. I put there the Royal Society of New Zealand and the Compass Research Centre. That's where most of the work went on. And the Royal Society is the people who kind of funded my salary for a couple of years on a fellowship. And my co-author is Roy Leahy. The book is a co-authorship attempt by the two of us. It's probably the last book I'll ever write, but anyway, at least I got a chance to talk about it. That's a photo of a lovely place in New Zealand by Roy's brother, who's a very good photographer. And that's just to give you an idea of where we're coming from, where it's summer, incidentally. That's the book, which is just coming out next month. And it's in the Springer Computational Social Science series. It's actually quite a, for me, right on the button, bringing together computational efforts and social sciences towards sort of, I believe that social sciences actually need computational work to be more effective and comprehensive. I'm just going to show you one technical slide. What is microsimulation? Other than that, I'm not going to say anything. Essentially, what we're trying to do is to mimic individual movements through people's lives, and we're using real data to do that. So we're using censuses over a period of time, and we're following individuals over that time, and we're using that data to create a model of how people's pass through the life course. And these are computer models which are statistically informed, and that allows us to reproduce the real world. We don't have to actually go back to the census. Once we've done it, we can fiddle around with it. We can be the mad scientist with this stuff if we want to. It just frees us from going back to the census and provides us with a tool that allows us to interrogate what individuals do in multiple social space over a period of time. So that's the next thing is data preparation. We have a starting sample, which is the census 1981. There are 3 million people in that census. We took a 1% sample, so we have a starting sample of 30,000. And then after that, we took the censuses from 1986 through to 2006. We have a 5-yearly census. And we just looked at how people transition between censuses, and we used that to inform. We used statistical models to help estimate how people did transition every 5 years, depending on their backgrounds, ethnicity and all the rest of it. And we used that as a model, a statistical model, to create the transitions in our synthetic file. And then as I say, we used a statistical analysis. Then we implemented it. We started with the base sample, and then we checked, we've got this fancy stats model. Does it actually reproduce New Zealand census? So we ran the New Zealand census. We ran our model through to make sure that it actually did reproduce the census. Again, only a 1% sample. We're not trying to deal with, like New Zealand's now 4.9 million people, so we're not trying to handle 4.9 million data points in the given year. We're just taking a 1% sample of the census transitions. And so we checked that actually we did reproduce the census, and we had to tweak things every now and then in order to make sure we did. And some other things which I'll mention in a minute. For example, what about people coming into the country? What are people dying? What are people being born? All those kinds of things just added to the complexity of it. And finally, we then were able to sort of play around with it. We were able to test scenarios. We were able to say, okay, we can reproduce New Zealand census, fine. What's the point of that? Well, the point is then you can start to tweak parameters and say, well, what about if the experience had been different? And also project forwards, which obviously is a matter of interest. So that's all the technical detail I'll give you. Not a lot of people actually interested in microsimulation, unfortunately, but it does allow one to provide individual level representations of the real world, and the real world is made up of individuals. And it does allow one to represent that world in a realistic way, and then if you want to start changing it, you can. And there are many examples of microsimulation. For example, Euromod is one that's used in Europe to look at tax benefit systems. Okay, so that's our starting sample. Just to show you, this is data from a very standard census. You can see all the usual things you'd expect to see in a census. You look at people's age, you look at their living circumstances, you look at their family structure, you look at where they were born, and you look at their education, you look at all the way through. So that is real data. We start with real data, and we derive our model from real data, but that's our starting sample in 1981, or 1% sample of 3 million people, which is 30,000. We drew that sample, and then we used that as our representation, because our power was just enough to go back to 3 million, so we took a sample. But what it does reassure you is that this is over 90% response rate, so we're dealing with a complete census of the New Zealand population, even though we've drawn a sample from it. And how do we operate? So we start in 1981, and we then simulate, drawing on our statistical model. We then create our own 1986, we create our own 1991, we create our own 1996, 2001, 2006. We check that they look like the real thing, that's, those are simulated. 1981 is real data. We draw all the rest from real data, and then we can create a model that moves through time. So this is part of the idea of moving through time, capturing what happened in New Zealand over a period of rapid social and economic change. Otherwise, it wouldn't be of much interest, but it was a period of rapid opening up of the entire society and the economy in a very brief period of time, and that really is what makes it interesting. Just to give you an idea of how this works, so what happens is we have our starting sample there, which is real data. We have a simulation engine, which has got these statistical rules inside it, and then we reproduce the census. That's a status quo. That's our little 1% sample of the New Zealand status quo from 1981 through to 2006. And then we can do two things. We can start to look at different scenarios, and I'm going to show you them in a minute. Manipulation, we can say, well, what about if New Zealand, for example, had not opened up to immigration? 24% of our population is foreign born. So that was not always the case. So we've opened up. So what about if we had never opened up a counterfactual and looked at it differently, and then run the model through? What sort of changes would might you get? And then, of course, projections into the future, which is a bit harder. Okay, so that's another photograph taken from New Zealand. So that's a preamble that shows you that's the technical stuff, the microsimulation, the concept of a simulation engine, the concept of reproducing the census with 1% sample, not the entire census, although you could always blow it up if you wanted to, but there wouldn't be much point. And now I'm going to talk about the concept itself. So I'm just going to talk about the inspiration. Where did I get this idea from? What was the ambition? The framework, the counterfactuals, what we did, the means we used, the software. A lot of this I'll just skate over. We don't have the time. The software is available, and I don't have the expertise, frankly, to talk about it. The results, and then a concluding section where I'll say what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, and what about the future. So the inspiration, the first inspiration was from New Zealand. New Zealand was regarded as a social laboratory in the 1890s and early 1900s. And as a sociologist, which I am, how do you represent an entire society? You really can't do that. Historically, you can do that as an historian. And I thought, well, couldn't we do this in some other way, like a computer representation with society as a social laboratory? And that's where the original idea came. Incidentally, New Zealand women got the right to vote in 1893, but not the right to run for Parliament. And then I applied that to a transformational period from 1980 to 2010, when we had census data available. So the idea of a social laboratory was spawned by historical interest and then applied to a real transformational period, as was the social laboratory period. The other source of inspiration was Canada. Way back when, could have been maybe the 1990s, I noticed the Canadian Statistics Department had a social policy simulation database and model, which allowed people to come in and to test their ideas about Canadian social policy, regardless of their motivations, regardless if they were right-wing, left-wing, technocrats or whatever, and they could use, in a protected area, use a simulation database and model, and they developed a open source microsimulation platform, which wasn't open source at the time, but now is called OpenM++. So these two things is what inspired me. The ambition, whole of society, that's the key thing. As a sociologist, I'm interested in the whole of society, obviously interested in parts of it, but why not the whole? And really, the census is the only way you can do that at the micro level. So it's dynamic. So the census, the New Zealand Statistics Department undertook to link people between 5 yearly censuses with a link rate of over 70% between contiguous censuses. And so we now have a longitudinal census, which is pretty amazing, which we didn't have before. Individual focus, so we had access to microdata. This has only happened in the last few years. I've been praying for the Department of Statistics to allow us access to their data, but you couldn't do it, and now it's allowed in protected circumstances. A framework, we use the framework of the life course of people passing through life cycle, and also we use the social determinants of life, of health model, but unfortunately, I don't think we succeeded particularly well with that. We use a generative model, so we use the microsimulation to reproduce the census, and that way it's self-disciplining. So if you can't reproduce the census, forget it. But if you can, you're onto something. And so your statistical model has to be able to reproduce the census in order, as a sort of a self-discipline, to ensure you that actually what you're doing is reproducing the real world. And that's what I was on about. We have hypotheses, which are policy counterfactuals, and we have an inquiry tool called SociaLab, which is a name we gave to it. Just to give you an idea of how this could work. So here's the early life. So you could, in 1981, you could start with a child of 5. In 1986, there'd be 10. In 1991, there'd be 15. On to 2006, there'd be 30. So you can follow through half, or let's say a third of the life course through that set of censuses. You might say, oh, well, that's not much good. And by the way, we crossed different dimensions. So we looked at living arrangements, education, employment, housing, quite limited, but actually you could expand it if you had access to more data. This just provides the spine, the backbone, which would allow one to do this from the census. And you might say, well, ending at 30 is not much fun, but then you move to the next one. So you start in 1980 on with somebody who's 35. And then you can go all the way through to 60, and then you could go to the late one. You could start with somebody 65 and end up with someone with 95. So, I mean, the only weakness with this is we're using the same data over a period of time, when in fact, if anyone did live to 95, they would experience very different environment than that between 1981 and 2006. Nevertheless, in principle, that's the idea that lies behind this, is you can use the census to follow people through in the life course and to sort of replicate the idea of that. Okay, so the counterfactuals, the idea here is that you could ask what-if questions. What if the world had been different? The first one is the decade of deregulation. New Zealand experienced a decade of very rapid change. Economy, society, everything was thrown open as an act of desperation, actually, to some degree. So that's one. So the argument is, what about the decade of deregulation, which a lot of people have criticised, neoliberalism, all that sort of stuff. So what about if that hadn't happened? The liberalisation of immigration, we threw open our immigration settings. So 24% of New Zealand is now foreign-born. It always was an immigrant society, but it's been opened up. So what about if we hadn't opened up? Because it was hotly debated. Right now, actually, it's not really a big matter of dispute. As long as it's well regulated, people are pretty happy with it. Early childhood education, in-work family support in the 2000s. The Social Democratic government that came in the 2000s introduced early childhood education, in-work family support. Did this mean that more women went out to work? They might otherwise have been the case. What about if we hadn't had, and we'd had earlier settings? What would have happened then? The baby boomer generation loom large in any discussion. What about if they'd been like any other generation, apart from their size? In particular, women undertook new roles in the workforce and part of cultural changes, plus technical changes, contraception and the like. What about if there hadn't been a baby boomer generation? The availability of life course assets. We tried to develop a model of life course assets, which I still feel is worth doing. We didn't really get very far with that because the census doesn't have enough on it. But what about if you could improve the availability of life course assets like education? Okay, and then future projections, which I won't present. So the means, data preparation, we had to harmonize the longitudinal census data series, which is a lot harder than you might expect. For example, missing data. We used MICE, which is multiple imputation chained equations. So, because we had to have a complete data set. So it meant that we had to impute data where we didn't have it, which is, sometimes questionable. We had to supplement it with exits and entries because otherwise we would have a cohort starting in 81, the same people going all the way through to 2006. We had to have births, we had to have deaths, we had to have immigration and emigration, and we had to build that into the model in order to make it a true representation of what was going on. Actually, that was that required other data. Statistical analysis, we just used regression. We used intercensal data pairs. So we said, what best predicts a person who in 1981, where they'll be in 1986, given what we know about that background, they're Maori, they're woman, they've got this education, they live in this area, they've got this kind of household, what is our best estimate of what it'll be like in 1986? So we had those intercensal pairs, but we had them right the way through. And we used that to estimate our transitions. And simulation, where we basically, having developed our statistical analysis, we put in our engine and we reproduced the key census parameters. And when we weren't able to do that, we scratched our heads and looked at what could be changed. And of course, this is like a training data set. We're actually training our model on the New Zealand census, which means it's trained with the New Zealand census in mind. So its generalizability is questionable. And then finally, interrogation using the base model versus scenarios with adjusted settings. So that's the means we used. The software, I'll tell you what, Auckland is the home of R. I don't know how many of you ever used R. It was developed at Auckland by Ross E. Harker and Robert Gentleman, hence the word R. It's open source, and they were attacked by management for doing that. They said, we want the IP, and they disagreed entirely, and that's meant that it's become a world-class language which anyone can use. So we were using we developed Scenario. We had a Shiny-based application form. I've had that explained to me several times. I said, what is a Shiny-based application? I've never fully understood. We endeavored to deposit as much as possible in the public domain. Obviously, you can have a copy of this this presentation, and you can get onto the hot links there. And we hope to share our software with both developers and end users in research and policy communities. And that's the whole idea, is that eventually they could be web accessible, but not only in New Zealand, but internationally, and that would be the long-term scenario. There's another picture. That is New Zealand. I'm not sure where. I'm pretty sure that is Mount Taranaki. It is Mount Taranaki by Roy's brother, who I didn't know is a top-notch photographer. Okay, the results. So this is a results, this is counterfactuals. Some of these I'll go into detail, others I won't, because some of them I'm not entirely sure I fully understand. I'll just grab my script here. The first one was the decade of deregulation. We altered employment levels to see what results we would get if we went back to what it was before deregulation. And the results were that there were increased welfare dependency and decreased income. So in other words, this is against the consensus, the international consensus. The consensus among many critics is that deregulation was a bad thing. But what this suggests is if we'd continued to go in the way we were before, we would possibly have had increased welfare dependency and decreased income. I think that's still contestable, and I've got to talk to Roy about that. Not that I disagree with the result, but there's something. Okay, this is easier, liberalisation of immigration. So what would have happened if we altered the proportion of immigrants to that prevalent before liberalisation? It's now 24%. Before that, I should know, but I'm not exactly sure what it was. It was very carefully controlled, largely from Britain and largely to specific jobs. And if we had returned to that, if we hadn't liberalised immigration, we would have decreased income. The next one is early childhood education and in-work family support. A large idea there was that it would support two-income families, which is generally the norm these days, and particularly women would be able to go out and work. And actually, as far as we could tell, I think partly because we only had a few years in which to look at it, we didn't really find any impact of that on employment levels among women. The baby boomer generation, the idea there is that we alter employment levels among baby boomer women to resemble what women of a previous generation would have had. They would have had lower employment levels. So if we look at the baby boomer women who went out to work more, partly because of cultural shifts and partly because they had the means to control their fertility, results are increased. If we hadn't had that, if we'd gone back to the previous thing, we would have had increased welfare dependency and decreased income. In other words, the baby boomer women had the advantage of reduced welfare dependency and increased income because they had those greater opportunities. Finally, the availability of life course assets. We looked at what would happen if opening up the tertiary sector, we introduced student fees, which everyone thought was a bad thing, but actually what it did was blew open the entire tertiary sector. The proportion of the age group going to universities doubled and trebled from the 90s. So what would have happened if that had been available earlier? And so we're moving backwards. Results are that if we'd had that increase in access to education earlier, we would have had less welfare dependency and increased employment and income, especially for Maori and women. So these are just you're the first audience who's seen these things, and they're still open for debate and discussion with my colleague Roy about it. But that's the whole idea of this tool, is that you should be able to have counterfactuals where you can tweak parameters and say, well, what about if things have been different? Okay, so the strengths. This is a proof of concept scenario testing, which I think is a worthwhile concept. It was a period of rapid societal change. If there hadn't been rapid societal change, we wouldn't have much to say. But there really was a big change, the deregulation, the boomer generation, immigration, opening up of tertiary education, just big, big changes. And a population increase from 3 million to nearly 5 million in 40 years. We have a dynamic microsimulation model, so it's over time. It's a whole of society, so it's not just one little subgroup. The underlying model has been tested and calibrated against census, and we have the inquiry tool, which is the R suite plus scenario. So those are the strengths. There could be others, but I was just kind of doing this after being told by Michaela, get that PowerPoint here quick. So the limitations, it's a predictive model, not a causal one. I would like us to be able to not move to a causal one, but that one was more model dependent. Its census data is universal, but it's thin. We basically have basic demographic data and not much else, which is what you get in a census. it's a longitudinal census. The linkage rates are incomplete. So we had 75% linkage rates between contiguous censuses, but once you try to get somebody all the way through from 81 to 2006, it was down to about 30%. So we stuck with the linkage rates of 75%. And microsimulation is demanding on time and data. It basically took us 2 years to create this four-person years. And that's why I'm keen that it should become, if we're going to do any more with it, become open source, etc. Because all that effort to produce something that would just sit on a shelf somewhere seems a waste of time. The future, we couldn't include household structure. We were defeated by that. So we have individuals. We don't have individuals in changing households. And I'm not sure technically how you do that. We had individual transitions through 5 censuses. We should go to 6 censuses. One of the problems was Christchurch had an earthquake in 2001, where a number of people died, and that's where the census was based. So the census was delayed to 2013. So we haven't been able to incorporate that census, and we were planning to. The New Zealand government has now introduced a thing called the integrated data infrastructure, where they're opening up all the administrative data sets in protected way, with the census as being the backbone. And that really provides massive opportunities for linkage across different data sets, including even surveys. I can see the possibility, although my colleagues don't necessarily agree with me, that we could go to this OpenM++ and be open source, and anyone could use it, and our system will be transferred into that. And we could have the main idea behind this would be to have an open source tool and data for all. So that NGOs, anybody could use it in order to test any policy issues they're interested in. So there you are. That's the presentation. That's the picture to end up with. I'm not quite sure where it is, but it's very fine. And now we're going to sit at the front there, and you can start throwing questions at us about it.
Thank you, Peter. Let's have a sit here.
Just grab my jersey.
So thank you, Peter, for this presentation, for running through us a little bit of the explanation on what that model can do and what the model is based on. And I think it is actually quite interesting in many different aspects. But I do want to give you the opportunity right away to ask your questions before I get back to Ichung. So who would have some questions of clarifications? I mean, it was obviously a quick presentation. Thank you, Peter, to keep a little bit in the time. Also because we wanted to have the conversation still with you about this simulation model and its applicability in many ways. So any questions from your end at this point? Let me just maybe ask one question. I mean, you have put basically the data which you have used is census data, and you used 1% sample out of that. In which ways do you think it is actually possible to access this data beyond New Zealand, which obviously have changed policy around that, but also in which ways do you need, how large do the sample need to be? Is that, do you need the census for that? In which ways can you work actually with the models also in different ways?
Yeah, so the reason why we worked with the census was, well, partly it was available. You know, thought, wow, what an opportunity this is. But more than that, the idea is that the census is the closest thing you get to a complete take on the state of a society at a given moment, you know, with 90% and higher response rates. So as a sociologist, that's kind of a very attractive idea. But this is one of the, I thought we were going to use the entire census, but as we got talking about it, we realized that was beyond our computational power and was unnecessary anyway, so why not take a sample? So we took a sample. So the sample is 30,000. It's not, you know, it's a 1% sample of 3 million back in 1981. That's not the samples that followed after that. So the data is protected. We only I don't think anyone from outside New Zealand can access, except under special circumstances, can access the data that's held by the New Zealand government. But the idea of what we were doing was that you could actually use any starting sample, and we could start a discussion with the New Zealand Stats Department about whether our starting sample could be encrypted or protected in some way, that it could be used in a sort of a more accessible way. Originally I thought that this model developed in New Zealand could be applied anywhere else, but I'm not so sure. I think we have specific demographic profile. The closest society to us would be Australia, where it might be very similar. So nevertheless, the basic concept behind it, I think, would be applicable in other places.
Let me just ask you another question. That on the one hand, you say, you know, it's policy decision making, and obviously you have run through the models and you have showed us some of those results. Yeah, you're basing it mainly on counterfactuals. Why is that?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I got to the sort of counterfactual way of thinking because basically I'm a methodologist, and I was interested in policy of being able to draw causal conclusions, because in policy you have to be able to convince a policymaker that what you say is going to happen will actually happen. It's no good just waving your hands around. You've got to say that in this particular study, which is bulletproof, if you do this intervention, you will likely get these outcomes unless something else comes into play to make it harder. So, and that sort of causal, that sort of discussion about what is not a cause, has a lot to do about the kind of what would have been the counterfactual, what the world would have been like if we had not introduced that intervention. So the counterfactual in policy making is, here's what the world looks like. What about if we introduce something to destabilize it or change it, disrupt it? It's a nice term that people like. What would happen if we introduce this? Would it achieve certain policy results? So I was just intrigued by the concept of counterfactual, and the nice thing about computers, computational, and also being a sociologist, you actually don't get many opportunities to conduct experiments in order to achieve causal strength. You can do quasi-experiments. So I was rather intrigued by the idea that you could use computational power to test a range of counterfactual possibilities which fall short of causal conclusions, but help you along the way.
My last question is now on the results itself. I mean, for example, you have worked on the questions you have asked. I mean, one example was the liberalization of immigration, for example, or the baby boomers. So my question is, these are very policy-making decisions which are on a very high level. It's very much a macro level.
Yeah.
How far can you go down of that macro level in terms of policy decisions which are down the road of that levels, you know, much more of a micro level, if we can call them? Is that possible with the tool? Would that be possible?
Yeah, well, so there are well-established microsimulation tools that are used in Europe for assessing policy proposals before the case. Because what you want to do, this is the beauty of the counterfactual, you want to say to a policymaker, well, let's just run that through the model and see what would happen if you did this. So the one that's used in Europe is called, the one that I'm familiar with, is called Euromod. It's based at the Institute of Social and Economic Research at Exeter University, and it has buy-in from all the European countries, and it has all the settings on tax benefit, welfare, financial aspects, so that you say, well, what about if we, say in France, we increased the taxes on diesel, would we get riots in the street? No, you wouldn't be able to ask that question, but what you might ask is, what about if we increase GST or reduce the income tax or whatever, and you could run it through? What effect would that have on consumption, distribution, etc.? So in Euromod, they have models of all the European societies, of all their tax welfare benefit settings, and then they're able to run for anybody who wants it, and saying, what about if we introduce this particular policy we wanted to For example, one argument in New Zealand is that GST, what you call VAT, for us is completely universal. There are no exceptions apart from the finance industry, which I don't understand. But a lot of people say, oh, look, why don't you take it off food? Because that would help the poor. I mean, I want to help the poor, but I'd far rather help them by giving them money rather than creating an anomaly. But you could do that. You could say, wow, what would happen if we did that? And run it through. So you're able to, it's one area where the microsimulation is well established and works well, is in the tax benefit area, and there's an established thing which has taken them a long time to build, and actually which is widely accepted.
Thanks. So let me get back to you. Any questions at this point now? Not yet. You have to think about questions if you're in this room. So Il-Cheong, let me come then to you. Il-Cheong, I'm very glad that Il-Cheong, he could join us here. He's a senior research coordinator at UNRIS. You're working in the social and development program, but also in the social dimensions of sustainable development program at UNRIS. Again, there's the bios of Il-Cheong. In the bios, you have them in the little note you have hopefully taken from outside. So Il-Cheong, if you hear all that, what do you think about that?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation about your wonderful work, first of all. I'd like to make comments on two things from the perspective of policymakers or policy researchers. They are the kind of data problems or data issues related to this microsimulation model, and secondly, counterfactual. The development of microsimulation model was mainly stimulated by kind of three policy concerns in Europe and Anglo-American communities. Firstly, the first policy concern was whether the right population is being served by the policy. Whether our policy is, serving the right population. Second was who are the winners and losers of the policy reform? And third one is how the new policy reform would affect the people who would get the benefits or tax exemptions or whatever. So basically, these policy concerns were very much related to neoliberal kind of reform trends in both worlds, in Europe and Anglo-America. And in Anglo-America, it was much more related to tax analysis. And in Europe, it was much more related to social policy. And I think in that sense, the kind of a macro level statistics in tabular format did not give some sufficient information to policymakers to estimate the impact of policy. So, this micro simulation model came in, and they started providing very good analysis based on survey data. So normally they use the kind of household surveys. And in that sense, we can find some innovative approaches done by Peter and his colleague, because first of all, it used the census data, which has much more variables than a normal kind of a specific form of survey data. And I think they can use various variables which can affect different life aspects of people. So I think it's a very good innovation, because when we talk about sustainable development goals, we emphasize the importance of interdependence between different goals and targets, and that means we need to incorporate more variables into the analysis. So this kind of innovative approach can be contributing to the analysis of sustainable development goals and targets. Secondly, I think it is partly related to counterfactual, and I think normally this microsimulation model was developed to make a counterfactual projections. And this is kind of an ex-ante kind of analysis for policy reform. And I think this is very important and beneficial to policymakers before they do something. As Peter mentioned, I mean, we cannot do large-scale social experiment for people. So I think this kind of innovation is very useful for policymakers. But again, we have some kind of cautions about this approach as well. I mean, Peter partly mentioned about the limitations of his research, but overall, one caution can be related to, again, the principle of sustainable development. As you know, one of the major principles of the Sustainable Development Goals is leaving no one behind. And there are so many rationales and ideas behind this principle, but we can find so many people who are undocumented in countries. So, census data can have information about those undocumented people, especially when you have so many illegal migrants in your country. And if you are aiming at improving the conditions of those illegal migrants who are undocumented, whether we can use census data to make an efficient policy for them. I mean, so we may have to think about the kind of combination of census data with other data sets which have information about those undocumented people. Normally, administrative data sets can be very helpful to complement this census data. Second concern or caution I have is the kind of fundamental conflicts between the methodology, microsimulation model, and data sets or design of data sets. Because normally, when we are all social scientists, so when we think about the methodology or research, we are looking for kind of appropriately designed data sets. And sometimes we have to make our own data sets as well, doing survey or. The problem I have related to this microsimulation data, I mean, they are normally using existing big, large-scale data sets, which have its own purpose. I mean, every household survey or census have their own purpose, and the purpose dictated design of the data sets. But sometimes, this microsimulation model has its own specific question, its own purpose. So there is a kind of conflict or trade-off between the design of data sets and the microsimulation models. We can think about the solution to this fundamental conflict, because census data or census data design was established a long time ago. I mean, the basic idea and rationale behind the census data was based on aggregate macro level tabular type statistics, national average and all that. It was not tailored to microsimulation models. Obviously, if we agree to the benefits of microsimulation approach, maybe we can suggest now it's time to rethink about the design of census. I mean, how can you incorporate new variables? So new design of census data which can facilitate microsimulation analysis or microsimulation model building. And third one is about counterfactual. Counterfactual theory or counterfactual analysis has a long tradition. Social scientists like counterfactual, and the policymakers like counterfactuals as well, because it can strike the balance between reform and non-reform of policy. The problem of counterfactual, this is kind of a common critique of counterfactual, but counterfactual is the idea that, what would happen if there was not the reform or if there was not the policy. But the absence of policy reform does not mean nothing. I mean, there is something, outside policy reform. So, I mean, the result of a counterfactual about the period of deregulation in New Zealand. I mean, we have very much a grim picture of a non-neoliberal period. But I think if there was not neoliberal policy in the period, there must be something different other than the continuation of policies prior to 1981. So when we think about counterfactual, we have to be very much holistic in a way. I mean, it is not just the absence of policy. So there are something more. So I think maybe we can think about much broad sense of counterfactual when you think about policy analysis. But I think overall, I think this is the way forward, because we were confined to very much aggregate macro level statistics in tabular forms. And Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda has a great emphasis on disaggregated data sets. I think this kind of analysis can contribute to these data needs. And I think I look forward to much more development from your research team on this microsimulation model. Thank you.
Thanks, Il-Chiang. So, Peter, more work to be done. But let me just hand over to you. I think a lot of questions, good remarks from and observations from Il-Chiang. So, on the data, on the counterfactuals, on the disaggregation, on not just being inside the world, there's an outside world as well. I mean, lots of different dimensions. I just maybe some response from your end.
So just something about the history of microsimulation. The guy called Roy Urquhart was the guy who sort of dreamed it up. And his main interest at the time was to track the US superannuation or pension scheme. So the great thing about microsimulation is you can sort of predict the needs over the next few decades by building a model of how people age over time. And that was the original concept. Very, very much bread and butter thing. And it's been hard to sort of break out of that, and maybe it's hard to justify it. And so what I've been doing is sort of spreading my wings a little bit and getting beyond that. Just to give you another example of how I've seen use of microsimulation in a very useful way. The Institute of Fiscal Studies in London, very hard-nosed, totally on top of policy issues, great group of people. So they use microsimulation to work out something which you see most policy interventions think of the impact at a particular point in time. But the great thing about this is you can say, what about if we can recreate a person's history? How would the acceptance of benefits and the like occur across different income groups over time? And what you find is that practically every income group in the UK has at one time or another had to rely on benefits from the state to survive. You wouldn't know that from a simple cross-sectional survey. But when you can recreate lifetimes, a bit like the superannuation thing, you can recreate lifetime trajectories, you can say, you can then ask slightly different questions, and you just get a much more complete picture. So I think it has things going for it. So yes, the idea of we've had a problem in our census. Funnily enough, we tried to go perhaps too quickly to a complete online version, and we actually had the lowest uptake of the census in the most recent example. So there are issues even with us of completeness of data, which is what you were bringing up earlier. But the thing I like about microsimulation is, and computer modeling generally, is that you can, as long as you are transparent and you check everything you're doing, you can bring together different data sets and you can get out of them far more than the originators of those data sets ever thought possible, partly by combining them and partly by just doing more with them. So the census in our country is just sat there, unused, requiring millions and millions each year to collect, and then it just sits there, and all you get is the aggregate readout, which everyone thinks great, and I think it's great too. But then you think, well, hang on, you could do a whole lot more with this. So that's the thing I like about this, is that with some sensible step-by-step approach, you can actually add value to, this is how I've sold it to stats, we're adding value to your data. And the next step would be to combine some of the data sets, which is kind of another step, which is speculative, a little bit speculative, in saying, okay, if we can do some data matching or even some individual matching, because sometimes you can work out which individuals have done a survey, then we can bring in more data. And so we'll get over your problem of gaps in the data sets. What would happen in developing countries, I don't know, because very often it's hard for them to have a full census.
Even they don't have vital statistics.
No. So on counterfactuals, so you know, when there's this group called the Causal Analysis Group. There's one in the UK and one in Europe, and I made a presentation to them on this kind of stuff. And a chap got up. He was a philosopher from Oxford, and he said, "You cannot claim that your counterfactual stuff is anything like a causal analysis." And so I sort of felt deflated. So there is an issue about what you can do with counterfactuals, and what we've been doing is recreating the past, but the most useful for policymakers is looking to the future and saying, well, hang on, this is quite a policy that might be quite controversial. We'll do a systematic review, we'll talk to all the stakeholders, we'll do a back-of-the-envelope calculation, and we'll do a microsimulation to see what the likely outcomes will be from Peter Davis's great model. You know, who knows? So it allows you to scope the range of possibilities when you're trying to look at the full range of options and making a well-informed decision. So I see counterfactuals in that context, rather than as being an open sesame to a great analysis society that beats causality. It's just sort of it's sort of added to it. I think that's about all I needed to say on that. It's great that you related to sustainable development. I think we missed a trick. We used determinants of health, which is not a million miles away from sustainable development, frankly. And I've not been quite sure how we build it back in properly, because what we've got is very empiricist. You run a whole lot of regression equations, and then you can predict things, and in a way, it doesn't tell you about what the real drivers, and you probably need a little bit more in that area.
Tim, do you want to comment?
No, I mean,
You're good.
yeah.
I mean, I have several thoughts in my mind when I listen to both of you. But one, of course, is Brexit. And I don't ask if you want to predict the future. Can you use the model? But I do want to bring it back into the health domain, because you're a professor of population health, in fact. And in some ways, we are a global health center. So I'd like to see a little bit, is it actually, can you bring it back into, I mean, you mentioned already the SDGs, but can you bring it back into health policy making, and in which ways and in which areas? Because it seems quite obvious that you can talk about income and taxes, and in an economic sphere it seems quite a logic, possibility application, if you want. But is it possible in the health field, where you have so many determinants, and not just the social determinants, but which you might actually get a little bit in the census as well, a little bit, just a little tiny bit. But you also have the political determinants. You have so many other environmental determinants, which you don't necessarily get the consensus in the census, because that data is, you would have to mix data then, potentially. So how do you see that as an application field?
Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. One example we looked at was how to reduce the number of people going to into institutional care. And so we used a number of surveys that we had to say, what about if we increase the amount of contact with the practice nurse, and using other data about how it might help. We use the National Health Survey to look at people's contact with practice nurses versus against GP and hospital, et cetera, and then said, well, what about if we could increase the amount of contact with the practice nurse rather than with the hospital? Would that actually lead to fewer people going institutional care? And lo and behold, it does. So that was a one-off thing that we did. But in New Zealand, we have a national health number. So you can cross-credit the national
Yeah.
health number with the census.
data.
And
yeah.
so you've got it all there. And in
Yeah.
fact, in many ways, it would help
That's
you
it.
fill the gaps because the census might have gaps, but then you find you've got national health numbers that allow you to find information about those people to help fill the
Yeah,
gaps. So
yeah.
as far as the complexity, that's another thing entirely. Yeah, that's, we're all simplifying in order to be able to get our minds around it, but in a way, simplifying reality doesn't necessarily mean you get a result that's actually going to help you in the real world.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think my job title is research coordinator, and I have to meet so many researchers with different backgrounds in terms of methodologies. The most difficult part of my job is to make them work together, because scholars with strong background on a certain methodology, they have a tendency to make that methodology a monopoly in the field.
Hammer?
Yeah, exactly. So I think the key things related to social determinants of health is to accommodate all the necessary variables into the analysis, and we have to identify the interactions between those variables. And in order to do it, we need to have different kinds of methodologies. So in that sense, I think this micro-simulation model can complement to conventional methodologies used to identify the variables of social determinants of health. So maybe we have to think about the way of making complementarity between different methodologies. I mean, that's what I want to emphasize as a research coordinator, because I have to meet so many different people with different methodologies.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I guess there's never one method alone,
No,
a standalone right method either. So let me just come back. I mean, we try to be actually quite punctual, so keep within the 1 hour frame. But if there's any other questions from your end, please do ask your question. Yes, brave woman. There's a mic coming. If you would just speak to the mic.
So, thank you a lot for your presentation. It was really interesting. And I had just a question about the model. Do you include the concept of time in the model? In the sense that when you explore these what-if scenarios, can you assess the impact when you say it decreases something or it increases it? And do you know how long does it take in order to reach a certain impact?
Yeah, so the demographers you talk about period. So in a way, we regarded our censuses as indications of a period-specific things that were going on in New Zealand as New Zealand changed over time. And then we had the life course going through. So people in their life cycle would experience changes and would grow up and raise a family and all this sort of thing. So those are two different kinds of time, which I'm not sure we exactly satisfactorily reconciled and used. So we would need to do that, particularly if we were projecting into the future. Somebody would say, well, how long is that going to take? How much of a person's lifetime or how much of New Zealand's future before that'll actually happen? So, yeah, so it's in there, and it's at least a dynamic model, so it wouldn't have been possible if we didn't have that. But I don't think we properly addressed it, and we needs more work.
Any other question? Yes, please. Two here. I'll just take you to them.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I was wondering whether you've looked at linking it to political election data and whether that's possible, or to predict parties winning or not, or if that's something that's too risky to do.
Well, I'm not sure how you could do that. I mean, you could do some data matching, but we actually don't have national surveys, adequate national surveys in New Zealand on elections and their outcomes. But one area where a student did do it was, for example, we have Indigenous people, and they're on a separate. The ones who want to be can be on a separate electoral roll, and we were able to carry out some analyses of whether Maori people who were on the general roll acted differently from the Maori people on the indigenous roll, and they certainly did. But that was nothing to do with microsimulation. That was just ordinary data analysis.
There was one more question here.
Yes, I missed the talk. I came too late, and I haven't read the book yet, so I can only be inspired by the discussion which followed. And what if and if then? Isn't it synonymous to public policy? It's a way to define public policy. Public policy just about asking what if and if then.
That's right. So it's this idea of SociaLab is sort of simplifying it. Every day of the week, politicians are saying, what are the options? What about if we did take this track? What would that be politically hard? And in any way, what would it achieve? That's really what they need to know. So in my view, public policy is a lot about considering options, given various constraints and stakeholders, political pressures and the like. And very often the evidence-based option may not be the one that flies because there's other pressures upon you. So yeah, I think in many ways public policy is about considering ranges of options and our model allows you to do that.
Yeah. Good, so thank you so much, Peter and Il-Cheong. I should close at this point. I do thank you all for coming along. I won't make a long conclusion, but I do think that we should watch out and hope that it will develop in one way so that it will become an open source and actually freely available, because it does allow us maybe to match it really with different census or different data we have, larger data sets we have, but also with other methods which we are frequently using, in fact, and then cross-check that in itself and match that through. So I think that really opens up new perspectives as well in modeling and thinking through our decision-making. So thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Peter, again, for being with us. Il-Cheong, thank you so much. And to Unrest for partnering. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thanks for being open to it.
Of course.
Shall I turn it off or on?